is cut that back their communication distraction and isolate themselves. Think deeply.
What do they do specifically?
Well, what you'll notice is that they all have a location, a separate location they go to when they want to think deeply. That's often cut off. J.K. Rowling, when she was struggling to finish the Deathly Hallows, rented out this big suite at the Balmoral Hotel next to the big castle in downtown Edinburgh. She goes, Harry Potter style thoughts, cabin, created this property of their house. It was so far from the house that his family had to go forever. He tried to catch his attention and let him know that dinner was ready. They'd go somewhere physically isolated and different where they can, without distraction, think deeply.
What does work look like for the rest of us? When you look at the average American worker, for example, are most of us doing this kind of deep, sustained work?
The type of deep work I talk about is almost non-existent, as far as I can tell, in most knowledge work positions. Even when people think that they're single tasking, they say, I've learned the lesson that I'm not supposed to multitask, I'm not supposed to be on the phone and do email while I write, I'm just working on one thing at a time. What they're still doing is every 5 or 10 minutes a just check. Let's do a just check to my inbox. Let's do a just check to my phone real quick, and then back to my work. And it feels like single tasking. It feels like you're predominantly working on one thing. But even those very brief checks that switch your context even briefly can have this massive negative impact on your cognitive performance. It's the switch itself that hurts, not how long you actually switch. So I actually think even very conscientious knowledge workers who think they're pretty good at focusing on one thing at a time are actually still working far from the sort of high performance deep work ideal.
What is the evidence that this switching causes harm to the quality of your thinking?
Well, we've seen this show up in different types of scientific studies and from different types of perspectives. I think one angle that makes it pretty clear is the work that Professor Sophie Leroy has done on an effect called attention residue. This is actually something that's pretty easy to isolate in the laboratory. You essentially give a subject something cognitively demanding to do that you can measure, like trying to solve hard puzzles, and then at some point you distract them briefly as the experimenter, have them look at something else, change their context very briefly. When they then turn back to the original cognitively demanding task, you see the performance drops. And it drops for a while. It takes a while for this attention residue to clear out. And this is essentially what we're doing to ourselves when we do that quick glance at the inbox or to the phone.
Cal, I'm wondering, do you think most of us are aware of the costs of distraction in our lives?
People, I think, intuit that they're too distracted and it's making them feel fragmented and exhausted and anxious. But we treat it, I think, in this more general sense of, I probably should be less distracted. And I think it's more urgent than people realize, that if your brain is how you make a living, then you really have to worry about this cognitive fitness. I mean, how are you getting performance out of your brain? Are you taking care to get good performance out of your brain or not? And people would probably be surprised the more they think about it, how much they're leaving on the table by the way they're currently working right now.
Does it matter that most of us are not trying to win a Nobel Prize or a Pulitzer Prize, that we're not necessarily geniuses? Does it actually matter for most of us that we don't regularly put ourselves in a state of deep work?
Well, this is a big shift that I think has happened in our economy, because it's an increasing portion of our economy that are essentially making a living by using their brain to process information and produce new information. And even if you're not trying to write great literature or solve a great theorem, if you're using your brain primarily to produce value, be it writing marketing copy or putting together a new plan for your business startup, these type of things matter. The human brain has become one of the main capital resources in our economy. It's what in the knowledge economy we spend most of our money on, is supporting human brains to process things and produce value. So we should care. I think the ability to do deep work would be relevant to the professional success of almost everyone in the knowledge work field, which is a huge part of our economy.
I'd like to run a little thought experiment. Imagine we're following a doctor as she's making the rounds of a hospital, and she's looking at many patients, and presumably the patients all present with different problems and complications and so forth. And I think what we would expect is for this doctor to very quickly flit from one subject, one topic, one patient to the next. That if the doctor were to say, I can only do my best work if I can focus on one patient, deeply understand that case, spend a lot of time with it. Yes, that might be true, but it's going to come at a cost, which is all the other patients that the doctor is not going to see. What are the costs of deep work?
Well, where I'd want to get with the doctor is just the ability, even if you're relatively briefly staying with each patient, to actually be able to stay just with that patient. So a case study I uncovered actually after the book came out was of two different groups at the same elite level residency. One group had a culture of email. So, hey, I need something, here's a question, what about this patient? And they're expected to constantly be available by email. The other group consolidated that type of administrative or logistical conversations to set meetings. And what the doctor from that hospital told me is that they had a real hard time keeping people in that first group, where in the second group people were much happier. So deep work doesn't necessarily mean I can sit, half a day and just think about this one patient, but just the ability to walk into a room and just think about that patient and not have to see 16 emails as you walk into the next room and have that eating away at your attention, that can really make a big difference.
You said that the people who were engaged in deep work ended up being happier. So it's not just a question of being more productive, but you're making the case that deep work produces a kind of intrinsic reward that doesn't come from being distracted?
It seems to. And in fact, this caught me off guard when I was researching my book. I ended up adding a chapter to the book that was not in the original proposal, that was all about these findings I kept coming across and these stories I kept coming across about deep living also just being good living. People who spend a larger proportion of their professional time concentrating intensely on a single high skill or high craft target tend to enjoy their work a lot more. And there's a lot of different factors about why that might be true, but I ended by saying a deep life is a good life. And that's something I really believe in. It can take a knowledge work career and make it much more satisfying than being in a persistent state of putting out fires and busy distraction.
Can you cite any professions where deep work is probably not called for and might even be a problem?
Sure, there's plenty of examples I think where deep work is probably not that relevant. A couple of the common examples I give is actually, I think being a CEO of a large company, you're probably going to better serve your company or stockholders by being a decision engine for other people who are doing deep work. Someone who people can come to, okay, what about this? What should we do here? You can be a consistent source of the vision and push these decisions in a consistent way. Another example is, let's say you're in what they would call here in DC government relations, where really most of what you do is context and connections and connecting the right people to the right other people and keeping up with what's going on in people's lives. That's another example of a place where long solitary concentration is not going to make a difference. I think there's plenty of jobs, in other words, in which deep work doesn't make a difference. But I've also found in my experience that the number of jobs for which this is true is smaller than people expect.
You make the argument in the book that there are lots of blue-collar jobs, jobs where you're working with your hands, where deep work actually produces much better work and also produces much better engagement with the work.
Right, I think the connection between concentration and craft is actually clearer in a lot of these fields. If you talk to a craftsman, they will tell you immediately, well, obviously you need to focus intensely, otherwise you're going to make a mistake, you're not going to produce the best quality work, you're going to get feedback immediately that you are less effective if you're more distracted. And a big part of the argument I'm making is that there's nothing different enough about a world that takes place on screens for this no longer to be true. So if you talk to true craftsmen, they already know the power of deep work. And so in some sense we're just taking this message and bringing it up to speed for the 21st century.
It seems to me there are connections here with ideas related to mindfulness or ideas related to flow, that you should be in the moment, focused on what you're doing. It seems to me that those ideas are intimately connected with deep work.
They are connected. So deep work can induce flow states, which is one of the reasons why people find a career push more towards deep work is more satisfying. It's not entirely synonymous with flow. We know there's other types of states that also count as deep work that would not fall under most definitions of flow. So for example, being in a state of deliberate practice, where you're systematically pushing your skills past where you're comfortable so that you can improve. That's different than a flow state. It doesn't feel pleasurable. You don't lose yourself in the time. When you're practicing like that, you feel every single second because it's very difficult. But that also falls under the umbrella of deep work.
And what about mindfulness? The idea that we should just be immersed in what we are doing, paying attention to what's going on in the moment.
There are deep connections to mindfulness, and one of the more important connections is that we know from the study and practice of mindfulness, such as mindfulness meditation, that getting better at that type of presence is something that requires practice and training. And we see this exactly happening with deep work in a professional setting. It's something that you train and get better at, just like you can get better at certain types of meditation. That it's something you have to work at systematically. It's a skill to be practiced, not a habit that you already know how to do and just try to make more time for.
Cal Newport is the author of the book Deep Work: Rules for Focused Success in a Distracted World. When we come back, we'll talk about how you can reach to focus, to sit with a single idea for a long period of time. And we'll talk about whether creating a deep work culture for some people means that others will inevitably have to pick up the slack. I'm Shankar Vedantam, and you're listening to Total. This is NPR.
On the next Fresh Air weekend, Nicole Gannett Jones. She created the New York Times 1619 Project, marking the 400th anniversary of the arrival of enslaved Africans in Virginia. Also, we talk with Blair Braverman, a sled dog musher who's run the Iditarod in Alaska. She's also survived a harrowing experience on the reality show Naked and Afraid. Join us.
Tonight at 8 on WHYY.
Supporting WHYY